Good afternoon. My name is Lucan Wei. I am professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petro Yatsik program for the study of Ukraine. Welcome to what I believe is our 32nd webinar on the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For anyone who's followed Ukraine in the past before the full-scale invasion, there's one thing that's missing from a lot of the discussion, which is Galicia, East and West Ukraine, and a discussion of regional divisions in Ukraine. Now, this used to dominate discussion of Ukrainian politics. I wrote a book that sort of focuses on that and its impact, but now it's almost totally absent. And indeed, it appears that the invasion of February 2022 has dramatically altered the character of Ukrainian identity. To discuss Ukrainian identity and how it's evolved both before the war and after, we have three major experts. First, Professor Paul Robert Magocsi from the University of Toronto. He's a professor of history and political science. And since 1980, he holds the John Yaremko Chair of Ukrainian Studies. He has written 43 books and has over 900 publications, including a very well-regarded history of Ukraine. Next, we have Professor Dominique Arel, who's an associate professor of political science and chair of Ukrainian studies at the University of Ottawa. He has written extensively on language and identity, and he's also very well known for hosting a wonderful annual Danilo conference on Ukrainian studies. He's also finishing a book on the Russo-Ukrainian War, and since 2014. Finally, we have Petro Kuzik from Lviv, who's an assistant professor of international relations and the diplomatic service department at the Ivan Franko National University. It's a pleasure to tell you that he is also a non-resident fellow at the Petro Yatsik program this year. He was chosen among over 180 applicants, a very competitive process. So it's really wonderful to have him here. And he's doing a project on Ukrainian identity during the war. So I'm going to start off with you, Professor Magocsi. You and your work, which includes this really wonderful, I have to try to see if I can get it. This not working, Ukraine Redux, which is a wonderful sort of very short summary of the history of Ukrainian and Ukrainian identity, which has been published, translated into Polish, and apparently will also be available in Turkish soon. You've described Ukrainian national identity as an intelligentsia-inspired identity. Can you describe what that means and how modern identity, Ukrainian identity, developed in the 19th century?
Thank you very much for inviting me, Professor Wei. With regards to the question that you've posed, Ukraine and Ukrainians are a typical and classic, until the 20th century, stateless people, like numerous peoples living throughout the European continent. I might add Western Europe as well as Central and Eastern Europe. And the stateless peoples ranging from the Frisians and the Flemish to, well, not the Flemish, but the Frisians in particular, or the Catalans, to all of our Central and Eastern European groups, went through a process in the 19th century where their intelligentsias, their intellectual elite, felt obliged to work on behalf of, quote unquote, their people. And working within state structures in which those states were not always necessarily favorable and perhaps very actively opposed to the efforts of peoples without a state to gain some kind of status, either cultural autonomy, perhaps political autonomy, eventually perhaps independence. For obvious reasons, they would be opposed to this. So the intelligentsia took it upon themselves to be in effect, self-appointed representatives of a people or nationality that they defined. And so in that sense, the Ukrainian national movement fell into this classic pattern in the course of the 19th century. And it was therefore, what I would call an intelligentsia-inspired national movement.
Okay, thanks. So, of course, there were several attempts at statehood, but Ukraine gained independence in 1991 during the as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Dominique, can you discuss the role of the Ukrainian nationalism in the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and sort of how, give us some sort of begin the discussion of sort of how Ukrainian identity evolved sort of after that?
Sure. If you allow me 10 seconds of self-promotion.
Oh, please, please.
Is the book that you said, I'm finishing the book with Jesse Driscoll. Well, I'm finishing the book that will probably be published in 2 or 3 weeks at Cambridge University Press. Yeah, finishing in the sense that we send the proofs this week. So Ukraine's unnamed war. It's about the war from 2014 to 2022, or that is January 2022. To answer your question, just before getting to 1991, to complete what Bob just said, intelligentsia driven, but in Western Ukraine, particularly in Galicia, which at that time was under Austro-Hungary in the 19th century, after 1867, there was, with the nationalities policies of the Austrian Empire, Ukrainian schools appeared. So we have, when we talk about Ukrainian identity, it became a mass kind of, or Ukrainian national identity, a mass movement, thanks to the development of schools in the west of Ukraine, but not in the east, because of course the Russian Empire banned the language. So you have the first Ukrainian schools in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, but by the 1930s, you no longer have in the Ukrainian schools the possibility of teaching the Ukrainian national history. So that was banned until 1991. So when we then, to answer your question, when we get to the end of the Soviet Union, what we observed first is how Western Ukraine drove the national movement. It was called originally Ruch, which means literally the movement, in the late 80s, which was disproportionately Western Ukrainian, plus the capital. So in a sense, it all started with a territory that had been, again, under Moscow domination only since World War II, so very different from the history of most other territories of Ukraine, but politically driving with the intelligentsia now in Kiev, the movement for independence in 91.
Okay, thanks. And sort of, you've also written a great deal on the role of language and the Ukrainian identity. Can you tell us a bit about the importance of Ukrainian language and identity in the 1990s?
Yeah, that is, Ukrainian national identity is symbolized by the language. So that is the main kind of identifying criteria. It's a little complex in terms of, there's a lot of people in Ukraine who prefer to speak Russian, particularly in Eastern Ukraine. Things may be changing now with 2022, we'll see. But it's the relationship to the language that is the criteria, in a sense, the ethnic marker of Ukrainian identity cannot be religion because of the shared tradition of orthodoxy, not shared in a political sense, but in a theological sense. So it had to be, it became language, was very standard. When Bob Magocsi said, there was what happened to this, the development of Ukrainian national identity in the 19th century, very standard for Europe at that time. So it followed that language in the 1990s, but it started with in 1989, is the proclamation then that the state must speak Ukrainian. And I think we've been all like transfixed with the performance of Zelensky. What is particularly symbolic is how he embodies not only the Ukrainian nation, but the Ukrainian language for someone who actually barely spoke it before. He grew up as a Russian speaker, you know, in a world that was very far removed from Ukrainian culture. So in that sense, language is foundational, but the policy of language was very gradual and tolerant, I would say, for 30 years. What was not visible was the relative speed over these decades in the development of Ukrainian schools. So when we got to 2014, actually, the vast majority of children all over Ukraine, even in Eastern Ukraine, were now in Ukrainian schools. Only Donbass and Crimea were the exceptions. So that you could say that's the latest phase of Ukrainian nation building through the school system.
Thanks. Professor Magocsi, I can see from your facial expressions that you have something to add. So I'm going to let you talk. So do you want to sort of come in here and comment on what Dominique said?
Yes. I have somewhat of a different take on this. First of all, I was asked, and I began with the 19th century. We all know very well that when speaking of national movements, traditionally, language has been one of the major markers for some stateless peoples, the ultimate marker. Myself being a child of Herder, know that and appreciate how exceedingly important this Enlightenment thinker and his views had on Central and Eastern European peoples. He was the one who made that great formulation. Has any people anything dearer than their language? It's the heart and soul of any people. So this is the kind of traditional view. When we speak of Ukraine in the 20th century, and in particular when we speak of Ukraine after the fifth attempt or the fifth experience at independence alone in the 20th century, after 1991, things changed. And their accelerated change came in the beginning of the 20th century, after the Orange Revolution, certainly after the Maidan 2014, and now where we are after 2022. What do I mean by my different take on this? Professor Arel commented, as a unifying factor, it can't be religion because there are various religions. We speak superficially of Eastern Christianity, Orthodoxy, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is part of the Catholic, but there are many, many other religions. In fact, the strongest and leading religion is Pentecostalism, and there's been a long Baptist tradition, let alone Muslims, etc. So yeah, religion, as with most people, cannot be the ultimate unifying factor. But neither language in Ukraine. How can we speak of Ukraine, the population of Ukraine, language being a unifying factor, when we have Crimean Tatars, when we have Russian speakers who are not only Ukrainians who use Russian, but ethnic Russians, and peoples of various national backgrounds, Hungarians in Transcarpathia, who speak primarily Hungarian. All of these people are Ukrainian. So what we are seeing, to my mind, since especially 2014, but most definitely, is a movement in which the primary marker for Ukrainian identity are not any of these traditional cultural factors, but their relationship to their state, which some people call a civic identity. People are Ukrainian in Ukraine today, and increasingly so, And this is a whole question of, what are the percentages and in various parts of the country, but increasingly so, they are Ukrainian because they are citizens of Ukraine, a state that has existed for now more than 30 years, or whatever the math is, since 1991, number one, and one that has now been forged in fire by having to fight a war that began in 2014 and has escalated after February 24th. So this is my kind of take on what it means to be a Ukrainian today.
Okay, thanks. Petro, I'm going to let you jump in here. I mean, when I was on the Maidan in 2014, I certainly heard a lot of Russian. And, I think certainly we've seen a lot of, deeply, Russified officials in southern and eastern Ukraine, spilling a lot of blood to defend the Ukrainian nation. I mean, what do you think about the role of language and Ukrainian identity today?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here in this company of such distinguished students of Ukraine. I just hope that our electricity at some point doesn't shut down in the middle of my speech, but hopefully not. I think two points that I have to stress from the start here. When we are talking about the 1990s and probably early 2000s as this early period of Ukraine's independence, I think that we are actually dealing with a very fluid and very dynamic social environment. And in this sense, when we are talking about some cultural and social structures, in particular, they were in process of constant reconfiguration and change. And well, Ukraine was really in a nation in transition with a very dynamic social environment, as I said. And when we are speaking about identities here as well, I think we wouldn't spot a very developed institutions there as well. How should we? Well, I mean, it also referred to these perceptions, values, and self-identifications. I remember these sociological polls in mid 1990s, when we often got more than 30% of respondents who had no opinion on many political and socially important issues, or gave fairly confused and contradictory replies. Also, another case is when some sociological companies started to include this option of mixed Ukrainian and Russian identity option, or even Soviet one, and we got something like 20% sometimes strong support, or even more in some regions. So I think that without going deeper into the history, that was already a difficult business to come up with, some definite answers as to what specific identities we had in Ukraine and what were the divisions there as well. And I think my answer to this kind of problem is that we should be looking for something like identity light those days. By that I mean actually some conceptions of Ukraine, some kind of markers of these identities, and probably also some deeper structures that underlie these kind of identities. And in this case, I think that we had actually conceptions, or two major conceptions or visions of Ukraine. One was, and I agree here with Professor Magocsi, that one that was spelled with rather traditional ethnic terms. So the one that was associated with Galicia, not even the Western Ukraine. And the other one was, I think, something that I call a post-Soviet conception of Ukraine, which is more vague, maybe not that well articulated, but also associated with particular political projects. I think that the competition between the two actually was one of the major things that we had in not only in Ukrainian politics but also in the society. Luckily enough for Ukraine, some political elites were looking for some kind of middle ground between the two, and basically on all parts of this political spectrum, I think. And this is where we started to have this option of civic identity as some kind of a compromise between these two identities light, as I would call them. I think that's what really was happening in this domain of identities that we had in Ukraine at those days, at least. I'm not sure I've answered your question, Lukan, but that's probably my take on this problem of we are discussing right here.
Okay, so that's interesting. I mean, if I understand you correctly, you talk about sort of identity light, of sort of this vague conception of identity that's an alternative to ethnic identity. Nonetheless, I mean, what we've seen, I think, to a lot of people's surprise in the last year, is that clearly Ukrainian it's not an ethnic identity that's dominating Ukraine. If you wouldn't have a Jewish president, right? But yet, for this identity light, people have sacrificed an enormous amount for something that right, sort of argue was vague or sort of not really well kind of articulated. I mean, can you explain sort of what accounts, I mean, for the sort of strength of this identity that, as you say, was so sort of underdeveloped?
Yeah. Well, I think it was, the development, the transformation of these identities in the meantime. So I think the second half of the 2000s, but also later on, they were critical for actually forging this more thick identity in Ukraine. And I think that we could also speak about the merging of this ethnical type identity with a more civic one. Again, because of these divisions that we had in Ukraine, I think that was, in this sense, a blessing for Ukraine, because it really made at least the elites think of how to keep everything together and maybe develop something that would, reach out to all the communities in Ukraine. I mean, we weren't definitely a desperately divided country, but I think that we didn't have a very developed overarching identity. And in this case, I think the merging of these two, and the key representatives of these could be Yushchenko, Tymoshenko, and later Poroshenko, and now Zelensky. because as you mentioned, they have very different background, but still they somehow accepted some parts of these, ethnic kind of conception of Ukraine, but also together with these civic elements which made it more inclusive.
Okay.
Can I jump in, Lucan?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just about to turn to you.
And me too, please.
Absolutely. So Dominique, yeah, please go ahead.
I don't think our positions are that far apart between what has been called like ethnic versus civic identity. What I'm arguing here is that language is the uncontested foundations of Ukrainian national identity. National identity. That doesn't mean that only Ukrainian is spoken. Obviously not. Russian has been, and Hungarian and Romanian and Crimean Tatar to a much lesser extent demographically, but Russian obviously until recently, well, at least until 2014, in terms of the language of actual preference in the day-to-day business, day-to-day life was almost 50-50, largely east-west. We know that. But the recognition that the Ukrainian language symbolizes the state. That's the point. I mean, you identify with the state. You may be speaking Russian on, in your daily life, but you have certainly no hostility vis-a-vis the Ukrainian language, unlike what's happening in all the occupied territories. The first thing that they do, and well, maybe it's arresting people, and then the second is to ban the language and all the symbols of the state, starting with the language. I think it's pretty clear. Petro mentioned the former president. I think we can even go back to Kuchma, although it was a bit gradual in his case. But Kuchma, and then Yushchenko was a Ukrainian speaker, but Poroshenko and now Zelensky were Russian speakers who, when they became president or had the highest functioned exclusively in Ukrainian, because now it's the Ukrainian state. So Zelensky and his entire, well, maybe not entire, but most of his team actually come from Dnipro. And you'll never hear Russian in their public communication, in their public messaging. In 2014, when you had the volunteer battalions, those who actually fought in Donbass initially, in Dnipro and Donbass and in eastern Ukraine, in Odessa, in the street, in Kharkiv, most of them were Russian speakers, but they would rarely message actually in Russian, because they recognized that Ukrainian is the unifying language of the nation, even if they happen to be Russian speakers. So that's the point I'm trying to drive home here. Russian is not about to disappear as a spoken language in Ukraine, although it will lose a lot of its visibility. We see that symbolically now with even street naming and so forth. But more than ever is the recognition that this is what actually unifies us. The language, that everybody has to speak the language in certain situations. It's now becoming unthinkable of even making a career nationally without using Ukrainian, irrespective of your preference in daily lives.
So, Professor Magocsi, would you agree with that, or?
No. First of all, what unifies Ukraine is not language. What unifies Ukraine is identity with a state, their state. And in answer to, before we moved on to each of us responding, Professor Way posed the question, well, how is it possible that we have all of these people of various backgrounds fighting so desperately to defend their country? Well, the answer to that, by the way, is, I think, very straightforward and very easy. It's one word or two words. It's Vladimir Putin. It is thanks to him and his disastrous and horrendous policies and invasions in 2014 and 2022 that has galvanized Ukrainians of whatever national or religious background to be full-fledged patriots ready to die for their homeland. And their homeland is not the Ukrainian language. It is not some particular cultural facet. It is the state called Ukraine. Ukraine has finally made it, in which an increasing percentage of the population believes in this civic nationality. We are Ukrainian because we are from Ukraine. This is our state. We want to maintain it, and we'll be ready to die for it. Hence the victory, if you will, of this Ukrainian light or identity. The identity question now has been in many ways resolved. Ukrainians are Ukrainians because they live in the state and will defend the state of Ukraine. And that is thanks to we know whom.
Thank you. And indeed, work by Al Stepan on state nations is quite relevant. And, I think Ukraine was for him considered almost the prime example of such an entity, as what Professor Magocsi has said. I want to sort of turn a little bit to these regional divisions that were so dominant in Ukrainian politics, especially before 2014, and just sort of talk about the nature of them. I mean, in common, discussion, oftentimes people refer to sort of a pro-Russian East and a pro-Ukrainian West. I mean, obviously these were crude simplifications, but any discussion of national politics always is a crude simplification. So that's not necessarily an issue. Maybe I'll start with you, Dominique. Can you sort of discuss what was the character of these divisions? What was meant by sort of pro-Russian? I mean, especially given the fact that the fighting that's going on now in Kherson. I mean, what are these divisions? What was behind these divisions?
Actually, Kherson, of the 9 southeastern Ukrainian provinces, was the most Ukrainian, always, almost in the 2004 election. I believe the score for Yushchenko was by far the highest in southeastern Ukraine. So it's most, anyway, the fact that it's actually the only regional capital that's under occupation. I'm not talking Donetsk, Simferopol, I'm talking the 2022 changes, is extremely odd. We understand, just the topography here. It happens to be the province that, is the gateway to Crimea. Listen, there's been debates for a long time, for almost 25 years on these regional divisions, but it seems to me that electorally, with one exception, but in regular elections in 1994, in particular 2004, and the highly contested one, so there were 3 rounds of elections in 2010, you could see that divide electorally between East and West. I mean, the Eastern candidate was receiving enormous majorities in all of these 9 oblasts. And the Western candidate, by Western, I mean the candidate whose electoral constituencies was in the West, again, was sweeping the, 16 oblasts. But in terms of population, it was kind of a seesaw demographically. It was like a higher density in the East because of the levels of urbanization. And why was that? I mean, in surveys, there were issues that would come up systematically. And one issue was the general orientation of Ukraine, geopolitical orientation, a little closer to Russia or away from Russia. I mean, it was actually dividing electorally Ukraine over issues of NATO in particular. And one of the issue was actually language, the question of whether Russian should have some kind of status, official status in Ukraine, at least at the local or regional level. And which again shows that language does play a role in again, the way you see yourself of belonging to the state. So that came back repeatedly. It was politically salient enough to have these alternance of power until 2014. 2014 changes everything because of Russian military intervention. So that's and now, of course, Bob Magocsi is absolutely right, and with the Putin effect, if you wish, but which is much deeper than Putin. But he made the decision himself to invade full blast in February 2022. But the fact is, it's not just that he's wreaking havoc and committing all these atrocities in Ukraine and allowing a genocidal language to be basically being uttered by state media on a daily basis, but he's actually attacking Eastern Ukraine mostly. I mean, the cities that have been destroyed, like in Donbass and Mariupol and Kharkiv, that is being bombed, I don't know, 800 or 900 times in terms of missiles, and Mykolaiv and so forth, are traditionally Russian-speaking cities, Ukrainian cities, but Russian-speaking cities. And that, this whole, when we talked about the divide before, the extent to which you had the constituency for which this narrative of we are brotherly people, we have like a common history, we share so much, that has just exploded, been destroyed in smithereens, because that's the people that Putin is attacking, that the Russian army is attacking. And it got to the point that now the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, so that's used, they no longer call themselves that anymore, as I've actually broken with Moscow, with the Moscow Church, because Ukrainians and Eastern Ukrainians certainly cannot understand that degree of violence and hatred directed at them. So indeed, Professor Magocsi is absolutely right. Ukrainians, in that sense, the whole of Ukraine never felt so more Ukrainian because of the cataclysm of the war. It was apparent already since 2014, but it's on a whole new level since 2022.
So I think this, kind of touches on the question from Charity Haynes from the audience, who says that I have assumed that strong Ukrainian resistance arose from people recognizing how much personal freedom would be lost if Russia took over. So is this, a question of, stateness, or is it really kind of a question of values of freedom? I mean, how much does that play a role as opposed to these questions of Ukrainian sort of stateness per se, or language, or the like? Can you speak to that, Petro, or?
Petro, okay.
Well, I think one of the basic problems with these discussions about Ukraine's divisions, and particularly the identifications and also some deeper structures that existed and probably also exist there in the East and South, is that we are kind of trying, as political scientists, trying to give a very neat picture of these structures in some kind of institutionalized structures, and in that case, I think it isn't the case. So that's why I kind of use this idea of conceptions of Ukraine which people associated themselves with, and there you had a bunch of different subgroups or maybe groups around these conceptions, and that's why it's so difficult to kind of draw a line, because I think it never existed as a very neat line, and here I while still understanding the point by Dominique about the language as a symbol of certain identities or groups of identities, I think it is still a more general, more or even more basic. I think that well, I agree with both Professor Magocsi and Arel that Putin's wars changed a lot, and I think that because of his brutal moves, this Western originated identity has won the competition. But also maybe another reason is that in the East and South, this post-Soviet kind of identity, it was anchored in the past. And once the institutions disappeared, you had to look for something else at some point, I think. And so that's why the Western Ukraine was privileged in this sense, because they were dealing with much more thicker kind of identity, and they could, it was easy to self-identify with such an identity. And in the case of South and East, well, it was too vague, too probably not that articulated also by their political representatives. I mean, Kuchma was a very contradictory figure, Yanukovych as well. I mean, they were trying to come up with something, well, in a way plausible, right? I mean, and consistent. But when you analyze, their speeches and some other texts, I mean, it's very difficult to see this conformity, and that means that people that were behind them had the difficulty of identifying with specific markers. So I think, I mean, well, that's what I wanted to say.
Great. Thanks. So Professor Magocsi, Professor Kuzik sort of referred to the kind of victory of a kind of Western or Galician type of Ukrainian identity. I mean, do you agree with that, or do you think this sort of what's happening now is the kind of evolution of like a fundamentally new type of Ukrainian identity that's really distinct from the sort of the old sort of Western Ukrainian type of identity?
Well, you've posed the question and given the answer, so what else can I say, in the sense that it's not, if one is assuming that Western Ukraine, and by the way, Dr. Kuzik pointed out correctly, when we use the term Western Ukraine, it's a misnomer. When we're talking about national identity and strength, we're talking about Galicia, Eastern Galicia, because Western Ukraine technically includes Bukovina and Transcarpathia, and that's a different world. So if the traditional Galician component of the Ukrainian ethnos was without question the most strongest in terms of identity, purpose, but today it's not that the rest of Ukraine has become Western oriented now. What does that also mean? Are we talking about Western oriented in terms of identity, that now they've taken on the characteristics of Galician Ukrainians, or are we talking about Western orientation with regard to the political world and NATO and the European Union, etc.? So it's not clear what the question here. Again, very simply, I do not see anymore, and increasingly so, a difference between Eastern, Western, Central, and Southern, because these are these kind of four regions. They are now being forged into one. And to have to repeat once again, it's behind, what is behind it is a loyalty to this state. And it looks like in much of our discussion, we are coming to some kind of consensus, because if we look at before 2014 or the transition after independence, we're in transition, identity is not clear, it's, what do you want to call it, Ukrainian light or whatever, but forget it, we're in a new world. And the new world began in 2014, and now it's certainly a new world in 2022. And in the 2022 world, Ukraine and its population is becoming more and more unified, precisely because, but I have to repeat it again, they're members of a state that they want to defend.
Okay, Dominique.
And pardon, I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
That was, by the way, a feature of Galician Ukrainian nationalism, if you will. And that is, they had always believed, going back to the late 19th century, that Ukraine and Ukrainians are deserving not only of recognition of their particular ethno-national identity, language, and all that goes with it, but they are deserving of a state. So that was a feature, a very strong feature of Galician Ukrainian nationalism, which wasn't clearly at all a feature of an attitude in southern Ukraine or eastern Ukraine, central Ukraine. It varied and so forth and so on. So that aspect of Galician Ukrainian experience has now been incorporated into basically Ukraine as a state, the civic identity.
Okay. Dominique, I have a, right after Euromaidan and after the Russian invasion of 2014, there were a series of decommunization laws that attempted to impose a kind of particular vision of Ukrainian identity that, were quite controversial. And what I found interesting, there was a interview with one of the officials in central Ukraine right after the 2022 invasion, who was very much opposed to the decommunization laws, who identified himself very much with Soviet culture and Russian culture. Nonetheless, he was vehemently opposed to the Russian invasion. I mean, what do you see kind of what do you see as the role of sort of this type of Ukrainian identity in the current conflict?
Yeah, it flows from from the previous discussion, actually. Listen, I know Robert Magocsi repeated it 5 times, that I feel, belonging to the state and so forth. And of course, that's what happened historically, and that's what's happening in real time. But a nationalism, strictly as an analytical concept, if it means anything, it's, well, first of all, that we're a distinct nation, we're distinct. So, and we ought to rule ourselves. That's eventually to have our state. It's important to repeat it because Putin premised his entire war, and he actually published some kind of a essay in the summer of 2021, denying that the Ukrainians are distinct and are deserving of a state. I mean, that denial, he repeated it yesterday, he'll repeat it until he dies, I suppose. That's very important to understand historically. So the growth of Ukrainian nationalism, strictly understood here as Magocsi says, eventually the belief that then Ukrainians need to have their own state, was accompanied by the growth of Russian nationalism, which denied the very premise, saying that idea is artificial, came from the Austrian, came from the Poles, now it comes from the Americans, and it's fascist and so forth. So indeed, I would add, as I pointed out, you need then to symbolize that attachment. You don't, have an abstract attachment to a state. So in that sense, the Ukrainian language plays that symbolic unifying role. But to answer your question in terms of what would be the other symbols here, or what are the other symbols of this Ukrainian national identity that has never been so cohesive east to west? The fact that Russia has gone so far, committed so many crimes, war crimes, but the crimes also of trying to literally eliminate, if not exterminate, a nation, a culture, will make it very, very hard for any kind of publicly expressed narrative of commonality in history with Russia to be maintained. And that's why you have officials who were absolutely opposed to decommunization or believe in, victory over fascism, Russian narrative, and so forth. Some of them completely turned around in February, like the mayor of Odessa, the mayor of Kryvyi Rih, the former governor of Donbass, not Donbass, but Kharkiv, because their entire world, the way that they imagine themselves, the way that they imagine the Ukrainian identity in a larger, imperial Russian, Soviet, post-Soviet context is completely shattered. What I think could be happening, because we're kind of seeing it now in the first drafts of history in real time, is the integration really of southern and eastern Ukraine in this national narrative, which had been overly kind of favoring the development of Western Ukrainian, particularly Galician Ukrainian nationalism. So Bandera is not going away in terms of the experience of World War II. Slava Ukraini, Heroim Slava have now become, the standardized greetings and everywhere in Ukraine. But in a sense, the martyrology of Mariupol, of Severodonetsk, of Mykolaiv, of Chernihiv, of Sumy, I mean, that's, Ukrainian, in a sense, national identity forced through war. It's a southern and eastern experience overwhelmingly since February 2022. We can go back to 2014, of course. It's just we're on a whole different level now. So I would expect then a very interesting evolution of or updating of the national narrative that for the first time will be truly inclusive of all regions, because it corresponds to the experience of people. And that in itself, since history is a matter of reinterpretation, will impact greatly how people look back then at the Soviet and even Imperial Russian experience.
Very interesting.
I think we have some kind of an agreement with Magocsi, at least
full agreement,
yeah.
Because Putin not only provided the motivation for Ukrainians to write, he made it now possible for a new historical discourse, because, as you correctly point out, one of the markers of nationalism and national identity is historical tradition. One small thing. We know that we're in Europe in general, but certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, you have conversations, people always refer to the war, right? It's always, well, the war. And really, they're referring to World War II. Well, I can assure you, now in Ukraine, the war is 2022, which means this is a new world. Just as you correctly pointed out, we now have a new historical tradition. And that historical tradition, first and foremost, is going to be based on the experience of the war. And it's not World War II, it's 2022, with a whole new host of monuments and martyrs of all kinds, which is going to be filled in live memory of people and taught in schools. So I fully agree with your position.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's very, very interesting. Petro, I want to raise one issue here about the importance of Zelensky and all of this. I mean, I think, it was particularly, interesting that you had when Ukraine was invaded, it was led not by a Western Ukrainian or someone who had sort of promoted sort of Galician style Ukrainian nationalism, but by very much of a Russophile, very much sort of attached to Russian culture, but also very famous within Russia as a TV personality himself. And I can tell you, because I was in Moscow during the 2019 campaign, a lot of Russians really identified with him. They thought he was a very attractive politician. But how important is it that someone like him was leading Ukraine at the time of the invasion in terms of unifying East and Western Ukraine? Or do you think any sort of politician, it would have ended up pretty much the same?
No, I fully agree with you that Zelensky is a phenomenon, actually, and Ukraine is very lucky to have him. Although I must confess I haven't voted for him, and as many in the Lviv Oblast. you know, I think for Russia and for Kremlin and for its propaganda, it's definitely probably the worst scenario of having him as a president, because Poroshenko would not, you know, would be a much easy target because of his image of, you know, some kind of nationalism, you know, someone who was also corrupt or something, you know, all these narratives that were there for years already. So I doubt that he would have, you know, worked the way Zelensky did, in the sense of uniting the you know, entire Western world around Ukraine. Because I mean, what can you say? You have a Russian speaker from the eastern Ukraine of Jewish origin as a Ukrainian president, and then, you know, all the narratives coming from Russia, you know, trying to tarnish this figure. I mean, they were just off the point, and that's, you know, it's really a blessing that Zelensky really is there as a president. So he's for now he's doing a great job.
Thanks. Dominique, can you comment on the importance of Zelensky in terms of unifying Ukraine?
I can only agree with Petro. I mean, listen, in a sense, we have an Eastern Ukrainian government. I mean, him and so many of his, you know, top officials, not all, but so many are from Eastern Ukraine, Dnipro in particular. And they're the one, and of course, Zelensky, it's also his personal courage. I think what he did in the first days of the war just cemented his standing to his own people and internationally. He risked his life, literally his life. He didn't leave. But the fact that Russia is attacking so-called, you know, nationalist Nazis or whatever, whereas in fact, Russian-speaking Ukrainians are running the state, even though they're messaging now in Ukrainian because that's the language of the state. It tells you everything we need to know now about the strength of Ukrainian identity. On top of it, he's, in terms of his nationality and nationalist, is not even Ukrainian or Russian for that matter. It's quite striking. So he certainly is the man of the hour, of the moment, of the year. There's no question about it. But he symbolizes something much deeper, that he's not kind of an exception to the rule. On the contrary, he's just leading a very deep transformation.
Thanks. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Professor Magocsi, do you want to have any last drops of wisdom?
Well, I don't know if last drops of wisdom, because, but I think maybe we should end it on a little bit of a lighter note, and that is that we have reached a consensus actually in this discussion, which has lasted close to an hour, and everyone sitting around this table is either an actual or nominal professor or activist in political science. And I think what we're seeing here is, if I had to tell students that, you know, training in political science and theory or experience in political science or even in history is maybe not the greatest training to be president. Because if we look at certain parts of the world, we can see people like Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, and now Zelensky, and maybe the best way and best training for being a president and leader of a country is to be an actor. How that acting plays itself out, it depends on given circumstances. And in this particular case, certainly juxtaposed to Trump and partially juxtaposed to Reagan, this has been a brilliant move. I mean, he's doing what an actor would do, with, of course, incredible personal bravery. So that would be my only comment. And I thank both of my fellow participants for their insight into what we've been speaking about today.
So thank you so much for joining us, and look in the schedule for further events. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, Lucan.
Slava Ukraini.
Panelists.
Героям слава.